Rain pours down a deserted street. A sleek black car slows as a little girl collapses at a bus stop, her tiny hand clutching her stomach. The driver's door opens, revealing Ethan Cole, a powerful CEO with everything in the world, but a heart that feels empty. He rushes forward, and what he discovers that night will shatter everything he thought he knew about life, love, and family. But who is this little girl, and why does she feel so strangely familiar? The night was heavy with rain, each drop striking the ground like a drumbeat of sorrow, and the streets shimmered under broken street lamps that flickered as if the city itself had grown weary of carrying people's secrets, while Ethan Cole sat in the driver's seat of his black luxury car, his tailored suit crisp, his eyes cold as steel, his mind consumed with numbers, contracts, and the emptiness that money never filled. When his gaze drifted to the bus stop ahead where a frail silhouette stood trembling, small enough to be mistaken for a shadow, yet real enough to halt his breath for reasons he couldn't explain, and as his car rolled closer he noticed a little girl, her thin arms wrapped around herself for warmth, her soaked dress clinging to her fragile body, her golden hair plastered to her forehead by the merciless rain, and in that instant something pierced through Ethan's practiced indifference, some unfamiliar pull that made his chest tighten, and before logic could protest he slowed, leaning forward to watch as she swayed unsteadily, her knees buckling as though the weight of the world had been placed upon her tiny shoulders. And then, without warning, her body gave in, crumpling to the cold pavement, her small frame collapsing like a fallen petal trampled by the storm, and Ethan's heart, long frozen by years of ruthless ambition, jolted violently against his ribs, the instinct to ignore replaced by something deeper, something human, something he hadn't felt in years, so he threw the door open, rain drenching his face instantly, and rushed toward her, his polished shoes splashing through puddles as panic clawed at him, a sensation so foreign it left him breathless, and when he reached her, kneeling on the wet concrete, he saw her face, pale, innocent, lined with exhaustion far beyond her years, her lips trembling as though begging for warmth, her eyelashes heavy with water and tears, and he whispered hoarsely, "Oh God, no," as he gently lifted her into his arms, her body feather-light, frighteningly weightless, as if life itself had been slowly drained from her, and as he held her close, shielding her from the storm, he felt a surge of anger at the invisible cruelty that had left her alone at a bus stop in the middle of the night, and for the first time in a decade, Ethan Cole wasn't a CEO, wasn't a millionaire, wasn't a man obsessed with his empire. He was simply a human being desperate to keep a fragile life from slipping away, and he carried her swiftly toward his car, his heartbeat louder than the rain, his mind screaming questions he couldn't answer. Who was she? Where was her family? Why was she left here like this? And why, above all, did his chest ache so deeply as though some unseen thread bound him to this child? And when he placed her gently across the leather seat, she stirred faintly, her eyelids fluttering open just enough for him to glimpse the ocean of innocence drowning in her tired blue eyes, and then her tiny hand, trembling and cold, reached out to clutch the sleeve of his suit, her fingers gripping with the desperation of someone terrified to be abandoned again, and Ethan, stunned, froze at the unexpected touch, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name, and then came the whisper, so fragile he almost doubted it was real, but the sound was unmistakable, slicing through the storm, breaking through years of silence within him, as her lips parted and she breathed, "Please, don't leave me, Daddy." Words so haunting, so impossible, that Ethan's entire body stiffened, his pulse thundering in his ears, his mind refusing to comprehend, yet his heart already trembling with a truth he couldn't face. And there he sat, rain dripping from his hair, staring at the little girl in disbelief, caught between denial and recognition as the storm howled around them, and the powerful, untouchable Ethan Cole realized that his world had just cracked open in a way no fortune could mend. The storm had not quieted outside, but inside the sterile brightness of the emergency ward, the world felt even louder as Ethan carried the unconscious child in his arms, his soaked clothes clinging to him, his breath heavy with urgency, and the moment he stepped through the sliding glass doors, a rush of antiseptic and the echo of hurried footsteps surrounded him, nurses springing into motion the instant they saw the lifeless body he cradled, their voices sharp with command, their hands reaching for the girl as if she were made of glass, and Ethan, a man who had never let anyone touch what was his, hesitated before letting her slip from his arms to the stretcher, his chest twisting with an unfamiliar fear that if he released her, she might disappear forever. But the nurses rushed forward, pushing her swiftly down the hall, machines beeping to life, and for a fleeting second Ethan just stood there, drenched and trembling, feeling as though part of him had been wheeled away, until a calm yet urgent voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, and he turned to see a woman in a white coat, her eyes kind yet sharp, her tone both professional and deeply human as she introduced herself as Dr. Elena Morris, quickly assessing the situation, asking questions he could not answer, then explaining with gravity that the girl was not merely exhausted, she was dangerously malnourished, her frail body deprived of essentials for too long, her immune system failing her, and her small heart beating against time, and Ethan, a man who could sign away billions without blinking, felt his throat tighten as he asked hoarsely, "How does a child this young suffer like this in my city?" His voice cracking on the word child as if saying it tore at something buried deep, and Dr. Elena met his gaze, her expression solemn, her words like quiet thunder. "Because people look away, until it's too late." A truth so sharp it cut him deeper too, than any insult ever had, and for the first time in years Ethan felt shame crawl across his skin, shame that he, a man of influence, a man who prided himself on control, had lived in towers of glass while children starved beneath his empire, but he pushed the self-loathing aside long enough to declare firmly, "Do whatever she needs, I'll cover every expense, I don't care how much it costs." His tone more desperate than commanding, and Dr. Elena studied him briefly, recognizing in his eyes something more than charity, something raw, almost personal, and she gave a slight nod, before hurrying back toward the ward, leaving Ethan standing in the hallway, drenched, trembling, and utterly foreign to himself, his gaze fixed on the doors that had swallowed the little girl as though she were the only thread keeping him tethered to this earth. And in those tense minutes of waiting, the polished CEO facade he wore like armor felt cracked and brittle, every sound of hurried footsteps echoing like a countdown in his ears, until finally the doors swung open again and Dr. Elena approached, her face lined with fatigue but touched with determination as she explained that the girl was stable for now, but her body was weak, her stomach empty, her lungs vulnerable, her veins thin from dehydration, and she would need careful monitoring if she was to recover. And Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hand unconsciously pressing against his chest as though to steady the storm raging inside him, and for the first time in years, he whispered a thank you, words he had almost forgotten how to speak. But the momentary calm was shattered when a new sound echoed down the hall, the hollow rhythm of coughing, strained and painful, followed by the shuffle of weak footsteps, and as Ethan turned, his breath caught, his world tilting violently as his eyes locked on the figure entering. The hospital, drenched and fragile, her shoulders shaking with each cough, her face pale but unmistakable, a face he knew too well from nights of passion and mornings of bitter silence, a face that haunted him in every success he had tried to bury her with. And as she raised her eyes, recognition flared, shock and fury colliding in her expression, and in that instant, Ethan's carefully built world fractured again, because standing before him was Grace Parker, the woman he had once called his wife, the woman he had cast aside in his hunger for status, and she looked at him now not with love, but with disbelief, anger, and the sorrow of someone who had carried battles he had never cared to see, and as the sound of her cough lingered in the sterile air, Ethan Cole froze completely, the untouchable Millionaire CEO suddenly reduced to a man face to face with the ghost of every choice he had made, and the fragile thread of control he clung to threatened to snap. Grace's frail figure trembled as she stepped into the stark hospital corridor, her cough echoing faintly against the walls, her eyes widening with disbelief and then narrowing with cold fire the moment they fell on Ethan standing near Lily's bedside, his tall frame shadowed by guilt he couldn't name. Her voice cut through the air like broken glass as she hissed, "Why are you here? Haven't you done enough?" Words dripping with a decade of bitterness that struck harder than any physical blow, leaving Ethan momentarily frozen as the weight of her hatred crashed into him, and for a man who had conquered boardrooms, silenced rivals, and dictated the fate of empires, he found himself powerless in front of this woman he once vowed to cherish. Now staring at him as though he were a stranger, he managed to whisper her name, Grace. But the sound carried no warmth, only raw shock and aching regret, while Grace's eyes, dark, hollowed by sleepless nights and endless battles, burned with fury as she took a protective step toward her daughter, raising a trembling hand as if to shield Lily from him, though Ethan hadn't moved, his chest rising with uneven breaths, his mind reeling back to memories he had buried beneath wealth and pride, memories of her laughter, of soft dawns when her head once rested on his shoulder, of a home filled with hope before suspicion and arrogance tore it all apart. Grace's bitterness hardened as she whispered, "You don't belong here. You never belonged with us. Leave before you poison what little peace we have left." And her words carried so much venom that Ethan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the chair beside Lily's bed to steady himself, silently wrestling with the truth that she had every reason to despise him, yet his heart rebelled at the sight of her frail body, her sunken cheeks, her coughing fits. She tried to stifle even now, and he wondered how much she had suffered alone. But before he could speak, before he could gather the courage to tell her he hadn't known, Lily's small hand reached out weakly, her delicate fingers curling around Ethan's wrist, her innocent eyes brimming with tears as she looked not at her mother, not at the man who had abandoned them, but at the father she did not know she was begging to stay. And in that moment Ethan's world cracked open, for he saw in her gaze the same storm of vulnerability and defiance he once loved in Grace, and the truth he couldn't yet voice screamed inside him louder than any boardroom victory. This was his daughter. Grace noticed the gesture and her breath faltered, panic flashing in her eyes as she tried to pry Lily's hand away, her voice breaking as she said, "Sweetheart, you don't understand." But Lily shook her head faintly, her lips trembling as she whispered with the fragile urgency of a child clinging to life itself, "Mommy, don't send him away. He saved me." And the room fell into a suffocating silence, the ticking clock on the wall the only sound, as Ethan's heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, knowing the walls of lies and distance had begun to crumble. Ethan found himself unable to shake the image of Lily's fragile hand clutching his, and the desperate plea she had whispered in that trembling voice. So instead of returning to his world of glass towers and boardrooms, he found his steps tracing the weary path Grace now walked every day, his sharp blue eyes softened with something unfamiliar as he kept a quiet distance while watching the woman he once dismissed as unworthy drag herself from one low-paying shift to another, her slender frame bent with exhaustion, her cough worsening with every passing hour, yet her determination blazing each time she glanced at a worn photo tucked into her pocket of Lily smiling, the only fuel keeping her alive. Ethan's polished shoes felt heavy against the cracked sidewalks of the poorer side of the city. The contrast gnawed at him, for he had once sworn he would never step here again, but now his heart throbbed with guilt as he saw Grace cleaning tables at a greasy diner, her hands trembling while carrying trays, biting her lip to stifle the pain in her chest, so no one would pity her, and still offering customers a polite nod despite their cruel indifference, until the night fell darker, and the diner's owner, Mr. Grant, a bitter man with narrowed eyes and a sneer that dripped venom, leaned too close to her with words so poisonous that Ethan, watching from the shadows, felt his blood surge hot with rage as the man hissed, "You're a burden, Grace, weak and half dead already, and dragging that child along like some cursed weight. If you really loved her, you'd give her up before you both starve." His voice laced with contempt, and Grace, instead of lashing back, simply lowered her head with tears shimmering in her tired eyes, but lips pressed tight as if swallowing 1,000 broken screams, while Ethan's fists clenched at his sides until his nails dug into his palms, an ache rising in his chest stronger than anything boardroom betrayals had ever stirred in him, for the humanity he had buried under. Her greed was stirring violently awake, screaming that no woman, especially the one he once loved, should be humiliated like this. Grace stepped outside the diner after her shift, her body swaying, her breath ragged as though each inhale fought against the weight of unseen chains, her thin arms clutching the strap of her worn handbag as though it carried her pride, and Ethan moved closer without thought, his instincts louder than his ego, his heart thundering as he noticed her stumble on the cracked pavement, her knees buckling, her lips parting in a weak gasp as though the world around her was dissolving, and in that breathless second, the sight of her falling became unbearable to him. So before her fragile body could hit the unforgiving ground, Ethan lunged forward, his arms catching her, pulling her against his chest with a grip so protective it startled even himself. Her faint weight pressed against him as her eyelids fluttered helplessly, and in that suspended moment under the glow of a flickering street lamp, Ethan whispered in a hoarse, trembling voice that shocked him, "I've got you, Grace. I won't let you fall." Though he knew she could barely hear, and the realization that the woman he once discarded now lay unconscious in his arms struck him with the cruel irony of fate, because for the first time in years, Ethan Cole was not the man saving face in front of cameras, he was simply a man saving the only person who ever mattered. Ethan carried Grace's fragile, unconscious body to the hospital that night, his chest tightening with every shallow breath she took, and when she was finally admitted, he found himself pacing outside her room with an unease he had never known in boardrooms or hostile takeovers, for this was not about profit or power, but about life, fragile and slipping. Lily had been waiting in a small chair near the hallway, her big eyes swollen with worry, and when she spotted Ethan, she rushed to him with trembling hands clutching her sketchbook, whispering almost fearfully, "Is Mommy going to be okay?" And Ethan, a man who had signed billion-dollar contracts without hesitation, found his voice breaking as he knelt before her and said softly, "She's safe now. I promise I won't let anything happen to her." And to his own surprise, Lily leaned into him, her little body trembling as though instinctively trusting him, and in that moment he was no longer the distant CEO, but a man holding the most delicate piece of his past without even realizing it. As Grace rested under sedation, Ethan stayed by Lily's side through the night, watching her draw with broken crayons she carried in a small pouch, her paper filled with simple sketches of a home, a son, and two figures, a smiling mother and a small child, but the third spot, the father, always empty, and each time Ethan's heart squeezed tighter, guilt clawing at him though he couldn't yet explain why, until Lily looked up at him shyly and asked, "Do you think Daddy's ever come back?" Her innocent eyes reflecting a longing so pure that Ethan, for the first time in years, felt shame rise like fire in his throat, because her words dragged him back to that cruel day when his pride had been bigger than his love, when he had slammed the door on Grace's tears, convinced that status mattered more than her devotion, and though he had buried that memory deep, Lily's fragile voice unearthed it with brutal force, leaving him hollow. He tried to steady himself, offering to buy her food, to get her toys, but Lily shook her head and said simply, "I just want Mommy not to cry at night anymore." And Ethan's eyes burned, for no boardroom challenge had ever unraveled him like this small girl did with her unguarded truth. The following morning, Dr. Elena Morris entered for routine checkups, her warm smile softening Lily's nerves as she gently explained that they needed to run a few tests, and Ethan stayed, insisting he wouldn't leave Lily alone, his protective instinct now undeniable. As the hours passed, Ethan distracted her with little stories about the city lights, letting her draw them on paper, and each time her hand brushed his, something unspoken stirred inside him, like a ghost of recognition he couldn't quite place, until finally Dr. Elena returned, her clipboard clutched tightly, her expression shifting from calm professionalism to visible shock as her eyes flicked from Ethan to Lily, and she hesitated before asking in a low, deliberate voice, "Mr. Cole, do you know that you and Lily share the exact same rare blood type?" The words slicing through the sterile air like a blade, freezing Ethan in place as his heart stuttered in his chest, for suddenly the empty father in Lily's drawings no longer felt like a distant figure. It felt like him. Ethan stood frozen in the hospital corridor, Dr. Elena's words echoing inside his skull like a gavel of judgment, and when the DNA test results were finally handed over, the black letters on white paper blurred before his eyes, each word heavier than the millions he had ever signed across contracts, until the undeniable truth stared back at him. Lily Parker, the fragile child who clung to his hand, carried his blood, his name, his very existence, and the air punched out of his chest as though the weight of years collapsed all at once. He stumbled into the dimly lit waiting room, clutching the paper like it was both salvation and curse, his lips trembling as he whispered to no one, "My God, she's mine, all this time. My own child." And in that confession his voice broke, a man stripped bare of arrogance, his carefully built walls shattering as tears he hadn't shed since boyhood finally burned down his face. But the sound of a soft cough snapped his head up. Grace was there, standing weakly by the doorway, her face pale, yet her eyes aflame with a storm that made his heart quake. And before he could speak, she let out a shaky breath, her voice trembling between pain and fury. "You don't get to look at her like that, Ethan, not after what you did. You left us. You abandoned me when I begged you to stay, and I raised her alone, through hunger, through nights of sickness, through ridicule. Every tear she shed, every question she asked about a father, I answered with silence, because you forfeited that right the day you turned your back on us." And her words carved into him like knives, each syllable dripping with the years of anguish she carried alone, leaving him gasping, "Grace, I didn't know, I swear I didn't know." But she shook her head with bitter tears. "You never wanted to know, Ethan. You chose pride over love, wealth over family, and now you think you can just step back into her life because fate cornered you with a test result? No, she is mine, not yours." And Ethan staggered, his hands trembling, his chest heaving as regret threatened to drown him, for in every flash of Grace's pain he saw the nights she must have rocked Lily to sleep with a fever, the mornings she must have gone hungry so her child could eat, and the cruel image of himself, cold, dismissive, blind to love, reflected back at him like a monster he couldn't bear. He tried to step closer, to explain, but Grace recoiled as though his touch would reopen wounds that never healed, and the silence that followed was deafening, until a small innocent voice sliced through the tension like lightning, and Ethan and Grace both turned in horror to see Lily standing in the hallway, her big eyes wide with confusion, clutching her crayon-stained sketchbook to her chest, her lips parting with the softest, most fragile question that shook the ground beneath them. "Mommy, is he really my daddy?" The silence that followed Lily's innocent question was a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls of the hospital, suffocating Ethan and Grace alike. But when Grace, too weak to answer, lowered her gaze, Ethan stepped forward with tears spilling unashamedly as he whispered, "Yes, Lily, I am you." "Her daddy!" And the child blinked up at him, confusion melting slowly into curiosity, then into a fragile smile, the kind that seared Ethan's heart with both joy and unbearable guilt, and from that moment he resolved to prove himself worthy of that small smile. He began spending his nights at Lily's bedside, never leaving her hand, telling her gentle stories about faraway castles and brave little girls who always found the light no matter how dark it got, and when she giggled softly, asking him to sing her favorite lullaby that Grace used to hum, Ethan's voice cracked on the first note, but grew steadier as Lily leaned into him, her innocence weaving threads into the father-daughter bond he had once destroyed without even knowing it existed, while Grace, watching from her hospital bed, clenched her fists against her sheets, her heart torn in two, one part remembering the cruelty of his departure, another aching at the sight of her daughter finally having the father she had longed for. Ethan, however, was no longer the untouchable CEO, for every boardroom mask fell away in Lily's presence, and one night, after tucking her in, he stood before the hospital bathroom mirror, staring at his own reflection as though confronting a stranger, his shoulders shaking as he whispered through sobs, "I chased skyscrapers and lost my family. What's the point of being a millionaire if I can't be her father?" His voice cracking with a despair no wealth could cure, tears sliding down his face until his reflection blurred into nothing but grief and regret. Still, Grace resisted, her voice bitter when Ethan tried to explain, reminding him of every night she had shivered alone, every insult she endured because he had abandoned her, and though Ethan listened, humbled, he never stopped trying, fetching Grace water when her cough racked her body, bringing Lily her favorite soup, sitting silently in corners just to prove with action what his words could not erase. But as days passed, Grace's health began to plummet sharply, her skin pale, her breath uneven, and Dr. Elena's usually calm eyes filled with urgency as she pulled Ethan aside, her tone heavy. "Her condition is worsening faster than we thought. Time is running out." And Ethan's heart stopped at the realization that he might lose the woman he once loved all over again, only this time with their daughter caught in the middle, and when he turned back to see Grace clutching her chest, struggling to hide her pain from Lily's worried eyes, he felt the weight of the universe crash onto his shoulders, for redemption was no longer just about apologies, it was a desperate fight against time itself. The sterile beeping of machines filled the hospital room as Grace lay weaker than ever, her breaths shallow, her hands trembling against the sheets, and Ethan, once a man who commanded boardrooms with unshakable confidence, now fell to his knees beside her bed, his eyes red and raw from sleepless nights, his voice stripped of pride as he reached for her fragile hand and whispered hoarsely, "Grace, let me fix what I broke, please. If you can't forgive me as your husband, then at least let me be her father. Let me stand where I should have stood all these years, let me protect her the way I should have protected you." And his words quivered with a desperation that could not be faked, the sincerity pouring from his soul like a river breaking free of its dam. Grace turned her head slowly, her gaze clouded with both pain and memories, the echo of his betrayal still etched deep, but as her tired eyes flickered toward Lily, sitting on a chair with her small hands clasped together, whispering her little prayers, the sharp edge of her resentment softened into something fragile, and with a trembling breath she whispered, "Don't fail her. Like you failed me." Her words half warning, half release, and Ethan's chest heaved with sobs as he nodded vigorously, clutching her hand tighter, silently vowing to honor every letter of that fragile plea. When Grace gently lifted Lily's hand and placed it into Ethan's, something shifted in the air. Time seemed to still, and for the first time Ethan held his daughter, not as a stranger, not as a savior, but as her father, his arms wrapping around her with a love so fierce it startled even him, and Lily, her innocent eyes shimmering, looked up at him with a trembling smile and whispered, "I prayed for a daddy, and God sent me you." Her tiny arms circling his neck in a hug so pure, so unconditional, that Ethan broke down completely, burying his face into her hair as his tears soaked into her little dress, his entire being undone by the miracle he never deserved but had been given anyway. Grace watched this with silent tears rolling down her cheeks, a bittersweet ache tugging at her heart as she saw in Ethan not the arrogant man who once walked away, but a broken soul who had finally found his way back. And though the wounds of the past could not be erased, she felt for the first time that Lily's future might not be shadowed by loneliness, but filled with the love of both a mother and a father. Weeks later, as Grace's health stabilized with continued treatment and Ethan refused to leave their side, life slowly began to stitch itself back together, not in mansions or corporate halls, but in quiet hospital rooms where bedtime stories were told and laughter replaced sorrow. And in the final scene, beneath the golden hue of a setting sun, Ethan walked down a quiet street no longer as the lonely CEO who once thought skyscrapers defined him, but as a man transformed, holding Lily's small hand in one palm and Grace's fragile hand in the other, their silhouettes painted against the light, and as Lily skipped happily between them, Ethan's eyes lifted to the sky with silent gratitude, realizing that true wealth was never counted in millions, but in moments, in forgiveness, in the fragile yet unbreakable bond of family he thought he had lost forever, but was now blessed to reclaim.